Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is the convoluted ranking of the Formula One World Drivers' Champions. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and my conductor today, as ever, is Nav F1. Good morning, Nav.
Good morning, Peter. Let's look at all of these F1 World Champions.
And joining us for the second week in a row is DanNoSkill. Welcome back, Dan.
Hello, good to be back. I'm excited to look at all of these F1 champs.
So recently, a listener submitted a file that a friend of theirs had made where they attempted to rank every Formula One World Drivers' Champion. This is something that some people have done before. I am known for doing rankings myself, although I've been a bit scared to try this. But we thought it could be fun to go through this and see what rankings we do and don't agree with, and also just talk about each driver and give a general assessment of them, so we cover sort of the full breadth of Formula One history. So if we get started, the first one, ranked in 34th, is Phil Hill. He's one that tends to get overlooked a bit. I think as a one-time champion, he sort of won his title on a technicality with the death of Von Trips. But yeah, I think it's a fair ranking just off the bat because his results outside of his championship winning year are not particularly impressive, I'll have to admit.
Yeah, there's one thing that is his results. There's also the thing that his surname is the third Hill on the list, and the two other ones are also much more memorable and just, I think, better than him. So apart from the fact that he became a champion 63 years ago, there's also the fact that his surname is not memorable. He won with Ferrari, which I guess is a big thing. But yeah, even as a fan, I never really found his achievements particularly memorable, although his career in sports car racing was very notable, we must say.
Yeah, Phil Hill is an interesting one. I think many people do see him as the worst F1 champion. He was obviously America's first champion, which interesting. But yeah, his win was, I guess, overshadowed by Von Trips' death, his championship rival at Monza that year. It wasn't like Von Trips died and then he was making up the points, so they were battling throughout the season. And like Nav said, even after his F1 championship, he did have a good career in sports cars still, I think winning a couple different events. But his career in F1, nothing overly special. And to expand on what Peter said, yeah, many people going, he kind of just won on the technicality of Von Trips' unfortunate passing.
Yeah, so if I just look at his stats quickly, but compared to most other champions, it's not brilliant. He only had 3 wins in his F1 career. After his championship winning year, he got 3 podiums in a row in 62, but after that, he scored just 1 other point, and that was in 64. So he kind of got lucky because he got to drive with Ferrari, but really his main strength was sports cars because he won the 12 Hours of Sebring 6 times and he won Le Mans 3 times. But Formula One itself, he stands out as being the first American champion and the only American-born champion. But otherwise, yeah, he mostly won his title because he claimed it at the Italian Grand Prix where Von Trips was already dead by the time the race had ended. It's kind of on a technicality, but he still, obviously, you have to still have some skill to put yourself in that position. Because I must point out, he did get 5 pole positions in a row in 61. So clearly a good qualifier, but not so much in the races, I don't think. So the next champion up is Mike Hawthorne. So there is only the slightest overlap in terms of his career with Phil Hill because Phil Hill joined in the middle of 1958, but then Hawthorne retired at the end of 1958, just after he'd won his title. So he's known mostly for being the first British champion. He raced with Ferrari for most of his career. In the year that he won the title, he won only 1 race, but still managed to beat Stirling Moss to the title because of how the point system worked at the time, of only the best X amount of results counting. But then after he retired, he started writing children's books, but only 3 months later was killed in a car accident on the Hogsback in Surrey. And it later came to life that he also had a terminal kidney disease. So he's somebody who kind of exemplifies the narrative of live fast and die young.
It's interesting that the 2 first drivers we looked at in this list are the 2 champions who won the fewest races ever, which is only 3 wins. And even in his championship winning season, as you said, he only won 1 race, whereas Stirling Moss won 4 and Donny Brooks won 3. So that was very notable. Hawthorne mostly won the title because he finished second 5 times, which is quite, praiseworthy in terms of consistency. And the main reason why he gets remembered is that he was the first British man to win the championship. We must remember that, well, in the 50s and 40s, Brits weren't particularly the faster or the most renowned ones. In terms of racing, it was mostly French drivers, German drivers, Italian drivers. So there's that going for him. But in terms of an F1 champion, he definitely does not have the same accolades as all the other ones we are going to look at.
Another interesting thing to note about Mike Hawthorne is many people say that if it wasn't for Stirling Moss being such a gentleman, he wouldn't have ever got the championship. Because in one of the races, Hawthorne had a bit of a spin. I think it was Portugal, and his car got stuck on the side. So Moss, who'd already finished the race and won, stopped at the side of the road, helped him get the car started again. The FIA afterwards go, that was unsafe. We're going to give you a penalty for it and disqualify you. And Moss then comes to his defense and goes, no, don't give him the penalty. It was fine. That wasn't part of the circuit. And it got waived. Moss loses the championship by 1 point to Hawthorne. There's also the fact that his two teammates did pass away during the season. So no one was really scoring points off Hawthorne. Whereas with Moss, his teammate was still there fighting him as well. So in similar machinery. So I think it was some circumstance that helped Hawthorne to also win the championship, which is why people put him on the lower end of the rankings.
Yeah, that was the first driver. It was Peter Collins was lost in 58. Stuart Lewis Evans, he died after the final race in Morocco. Was he the other one? I'm trying to remember who the other one would have been. If there were 3 drivers that year that died. Luigi Musso, actually.
Luigi Musso and
that
Peter
was it.
Collins.
Yeah, those are the two. Yeah. And maybe that's you can see that in the way that obviously Moss did get the disqualification overturned, the sportsmanship, but also I think the camaraderie, because they were kind of close knit because of everyone understood the dangers of what they were doing, very much so. Yeah, again, his F1 results not brilliant, only 3 wins, although his first win was a very good one because it was basically a 4-way battle for the fight for the lead with Fangio was in there, Farina Gonzalez, and he eventually won that race. But there was a 4-year gap between his second and third wins. But again, another driver who in sports cars was very good because he won Le Mans in 55, he won the 12 Hours of Sebring also in 55, and the 24 Hours of Spa in 53, and the 12 Hours of Pescara in 53. So, yeah, this is the thing back then, is that you look at their results and think, oh, they only did like 30 or 40 races. But then you remember there were lots of non-championship races. They were allowed to race in sports cars as well and do loads of other things. So they were definitely kept busy, even if there maybe aren't too many official Formula One races that they did in their careers.
And one last thing we should mention about Hawthorne is that there was a very famous rivalry between him and his teammate Luigi Musso. And Musso famously hated Collins and Hawthorne, who would often just, plan races together against Musso. There was a book, I think, written by Musso's wife, or maybe a huge interview where she revealed everything and basically said that, well, Musso died because he was chasing Hawthorne so aggressively because he just couldn't bear the thought of Hawthorne possibly becoming champion. So when Collins and Hawthorne also died, Musso's wife said, yeah, I was just happy, I don't care about saying it. At that time, you said that there was camaraderie in terms of knowing the dangers of racing, but you had to make friends as well because that's how you basically survived. And when Dan said Stirling Moss helped Hawthorne, again, that was this famous clans that kind of just existed back in the 50s in F1.
Moving on, 94. Well, I mean, Schumacher would have just breezed that without his 2 disqualifications and 2 race bans. 95, he blew it really badly. The 96, his rookie teammate took the title to the final round, which doesn't look brilliant on him. But I get that, like Mansell, he's one of the sort of cult heroes for Brits as the 2 main British drivers in the 90s. But yeah, generally, I don't rate him particularly highly. So in 32nd, it's Damon Hill.
Well, just doing some research for this video, I encountered a ranking that Bleacher Report had made, I think, in 2014, ranking all the champions. That one had Damon Hill in 14th because he has won nearly 20% of the races he started, and his short career keeps him from being ranked even higher. So I'm not too sure what that ranking was about, because obviously he won 20% of the races he entered thanks to having such good cars. Being in a Williams during that era was incredible. I always say that Damon Hill is an example of how talent does exist, like inherent scientific talent in your blood, because starting karting when he's 21 and then starting F1 when you're 31 and still being among the fastest on the grid, that's not something that should happen, and it just did, because somehow it was in his blood to be this fast. And his actual F1 career, I mean, yes, he did become a champion, but he was so close to losing to a rookie Jacques Villeneuve, which would have looked very bad, and it was only a few points away.
I guess to play devil's advocate in a way, I'll come to Hill's defense somewhat. I do think if in 1994 the whole incident with Schumacher in the last race hadn't have happened and he likely would have won, I think people would rate him higher than they do now because he would have beaten Schumacher in a fight, which is a big feat. In 95, it was a lackluster year. I don't think there's much you can really defend him on apart from saying that his mental state just wasn't there. He'd seen the death of Senna the year before. He'd just come off the back of that title where Schumacher has arguably bend the rules a little bit in the final race. So his mental state wasn't really there in 95, which is, I think, what led to the dip in performance. And then also, yes, Jacques Villeneuve came in as a rookie to fight him, but he also came in as reigning IndyCar champion, which is not a mean feat in itself. It's not an easy feat in itself, sorry. So he's not exactly going against someone with no racing skill. He's going against a very good racer who's had a lot of experience. Again, he had a really good race with Arrows in Hungary, where he brought that awful car to nearly a win and second. He won in the Jordan in 98 in that really chaotic Spa race. And then 99 was kind of that year where he was definitely too old for F1. You mentioned that article saying if he'd been in F1 longer, we would have seen more. I don't think we would have, because he was completely off the pace of his teammate. And 99, I think he was ready to just take a step back from F1 there. He wasn't happy at all. So I'll come to his defense a little bit.
Yeah, he's a driver who realistically his career should have started in probably 1985, not 1992. And then you can say, okay, he's had 14 years in F1 and done all of this. He has a very, very bizarre career trajectory. But generally, I think a measure of the man when it comes to Formula One is how they perform in uncompetitive cars. And so obviously, after he left Williams, or I say left, he was essentially lost his seat. People think, oh, he went to Arrows because there was nowhere else to go and it was kind of any port in a storm. He actually chose to go there because they were offering him a better salary than I think McLaren and possibly even Ferrari had looked at him. Most of that year, he was actually fairly decent, though. Obviously, the Hungary, the win that never happened, is a real standout. He had Pedro Diniz as his teammate, who was just a pay driver, but it wasn't a good car, and he generally drove well. Again, 98, once they revamped that car mid-season, he took the win in Belgium, lots of good results. But yeah, 99 was just abominably bad. If you consider that Frentzen was within touching distance of the title in the same car, and Hill scored points only 4 times, and then in the final race he gave up because what was described as mental fatigue, but basically just checking out. It wasn't a good showing for him, but yeah, I think generally he's probably one of the earliest beneficiaries of stat inflation by having access to such good machinery so early in his career. Okay, so the next driver is Jenson Button. Yeah, I don't agree with this, having him ranked that low. I was never a fan of Button in his day because I was always a Vettel fan. But you couldn't deny that his biggest strength was changeable conditions in the wet because he had such a smooth driving style. Although he did the fairy tale year of Brawn, he was extremely lucky to get that gig because before that he'd been 2004 was a good year. He got that win in 06, but otherwise it wasn't really going anywhere. And pre-Hamilton, British F1 was in a bit of a slump because this was long after Mansell and Hill had gone. Coulthard was faltering. Johnny Herbert was gone as well, and Button just wasn't there or thereabouts. But from Braun onwards, it was very good. And the years against Lewis, he was very even against Lewis, I think.
Yeah, and he was very consistent, and that's always something that you have to praise in a driver. But he was consistently in this upper midfield tier and never quite challenging the very best drivers. And when Kimi Räikkönen and Fernando Alonso just stormed through the field and appeared in 2001, then obviously were instantly contending, were among the title contenders in 2003. You had Jenson Button, who had entered the sport kind of at the same time as them, 3 years, a year earlier than both of them, and he was just falling behind a little bit. And even in 2004, when Button had that seemingly good season, a lot of people do not really respect it as much, because even though he was getting the results, apparently because Takuma Sato was also not delivering as much as he should have been doing, well, you cannot read. Button was kind of underperforming. So he did come to his own, and at McLaren, as Lewis Hamilton's teammate, he did deliver. But even in 2011, which a lot of people use against Lewis as, oh, look, he got beaten so badly by Jenson Button. That was a year where Lewis Hamilton was going through so much just attention because of his breakup and just his personal state. And yes, Button performed, and that was probably his best F1 season. But in general, he wasn't a stellar driver. But should he be 31st on the list? Not at all. I do not agree with that at all.
I have to same with you guys. I don't agree with him being this far down the list. I think Button, especially like you said, in the McLaren years, Button was a consistent driver. Canada 2011 is something you can always point to, where he had that race win despite 6 pit stops and having to go through these treacherous conditions, getting caught up in incidents with Hamilton, his teammate, and incidents with other drivers as well, and then taking the victory on the last lap as Vettel kind of has a fault in one of the corners. People point to that as like, that's Button at his best. I think 2009 with Braun, he delivers in, those first 7 races, really good for him. And then I think the pressure gets to him with Braun, because he's been in F1 for so long, and it's taken him quite a while to ever really get good results. He obviously, I think it was something like 113 race entries till he saw his first win, which many people saw as like, that's really long, at the time it was. I know Lando Norris is closing in on that now. But yeah, Button, I think the pressure got to him in 2009 towards the end of the season, and he pulled it out the bag, obviously, in Brazil with Barrichello having some issues. So 31st is too low, but again, he wouldn't be that much higher for me.
Quickly, I've also always considered him as one of the best drivers in changeable conditions ever. Like, just that those few laps when it just swaps to inters, Alonso and Button have always shown for me, but Button in particular, he always knew, at least between 2009 and 2012, when it started raining, he always knew when to pit, which was incredible, because he would make the call and it would usually work out. And that really stood out for me.
Yeah, I mean, most people will say Canada 2011 is his best win. I would even nominate Australia 2010, because he managed to keep the soft tyre going for 52 laps on a damp track as well. So he knew exactly what he was doing when it came to tyre management. But I think with 2009, you can make some comparisons here to 1995, because you had... So he won 6 of the first 7 races, and then won no other races after that, because the Brawn, it was really strong from the start because it was well built and they had the double diffuser, but then they didn't have the money to make any modifications to it. And the car was actually getting worse to drive as the year went on, because the chassis was warping and deforming over time and they couldn't fix it. But Red Bull had a car that at first was weaker, and then eventually it did get much stronger. But the problem was that Vettel made so many mistakes in the first few races that he cost himself a huge amount of points and was basically playing catch up and hadn't caught fast enough. And so there is the parallel with 95, that the Williams was the better car than the Benetton, and the Benetton wasn't particularly easy to drive, but Hill just made so many mistakes that he cost them he threw away lots of really good results, and so that definitely comes into play. But yeah, his earlier season, it gets kind of forgotten because it was a long time ago and he got no wins. But 2004, he got 11 podiums, with no wins because almost every race was won by Ferrari. And even the second half of 2005, when they suddenly upgraded the BAR, he went from the 2-race ban and then not starting in Indy, and then he scored points in every remaining race, whereas Takuma Sato got 1 point. So he clearly had the edge on him. But then the final stint with McLaren, it was just a bit anonymous alongside Alonso, who again didn't like the car either. Alonso complained a lot more, but yeah, he just has these patches of sort of anonymity, but then just when he had good machinery, he drove it really well.
Yeah, and however bad that McLaren Honda was in 2015, he did beat Alonso on points. It's not very notable because you had to finish a race and it was a bit of a lottery with that car, but it's still something that can be noted that he beat Lewis in 2011 and he beat Alonso in 2015 as his teammate, as the teammate. So you can't really fault that because most drivers have gotten absolutely smashed by those two.
Yep. So in 30th is Jacques Villeneuve. This is a driver that flopped like mad, because as mentioned before, he came into Formula One off the bat of being IndyCar champion, and then was then given this opportunity with Williams. Did a ton of testing. Early career, I used to make comparisons to Lewis. Obviously, it very quickly went in a very different direction to Lewis's career. Yeah, runner-up first season, gets the title second, and then after he leaves Williams for BAR, it just doesn't land, and it's just, yeah, points here and there, and then eventually he crashes at Germany in 2006 and just walks away. And it's hard to forget that he was a champion 9 years earlier.
Yeah, Villeneuve is a weird one because his arrival into Formula One seemed to rejuvenate attention into the sport because he just came from another championship at the time and was instantly on pace. Now, as you said, there was a lot of testing involved, especially in the 90s. Well, especially in the noughties and 90s. When you see a rookie come into the sport, you always have to consider how much testing they got. Villeneuve definitely had a lot of assistance there. Great rookie season, but after winning the title, he fell off so dramatically that, yeah, most people will always put him in the 5 worst champions in their rankings for sure.
I think the main thing is, do you agree with Jenson Button being lower than Jacques Villeneuve? And personally, I don't. I agree with Jacques Villeneuve being probably down here because, yeah, he had those 2 good seasons and then just seemed to fall away. Obviously, I don't know if anyone remembers that story, though, after his world championship when he was with Ricardo Zonta. They had that bet on who could take a Rouge flat. So it's not like he lost the drive to be in F1. I think it was partly down to machinery and just not really being able to click with it again after Williams.
Yeah, and in that little wager, both him and Zonta crashed, proving you can't go through Eau Rouge flats, or at least not in that car, because that car was terrible. Because he after leaving Williams, he moved to BAR, and his thing was, I'm going to do a Schumacher and revamp it like he did with Ferrari and bring in my dream team and build it up from the ground up. And then there were 11 consecutive retirements, and he didn't score a single point, and they finished bottom of the constructors behind Arrows and Minardi. So that never really worked. He had 2 podiums with them in 2001, but otherwise his BAR career was a massive flop, and eventually they fired him. It just didn't land. I mean, maybe he's somebody that he just lost that drive, or was lucky that he started his career with such good machinery. But the rest of his career is very, very, very unexceptional. Is the only way I can describe it, really.
Yeah, and he became a bit of a star after he won with his famous dyed hair, and then his career in music and all of his outrageous just things that he would do on the grid. So he was a fun character in that sense, but he definitely did not strike you as an F1 world champion, which he did become. So yeah, he did give us one of the most famous F1 moments of all time at Jerez with Schumacher, but other than that, if that didn't happen, I'm not sure we would remember his championship winning season for a lot of things.
I will point out though, he was a bit forward thinking in one sense that he was one of the first drivers to adopt left foot braking. Because at the time in the mid 90s, everyone there was still a clutch. They still had a clutch pedal, even though they would only use it at the race starts. But because of the way that the Williams chassis was designed, and they put them in this kind of reclined driving position, it made it easier to do that. So he started doing left foot braking. He had some very weird setup preferences for his cars that made them basically undrivable for most other drivers. In particular, I think he had an extremely sensitive, very, very short throttle, which a lot of people didn't enjoy. So he had a few quirks, which maybe came out of him honing his craft in America and IndyCar. I don't know, but yeah, he was a very interesting figure in his early career. It just flopped very quickly into obscurity. So 29th is Giuseppe Farina, Formula One's first drivers' champion. So he is interesting because he was 44 when he won the title. It was the inaugural year of Formula One, but by this point he was pretty much at the tail end of his career because he'd been racing professionally since the early 1930s, and he'd won 3 European Grand Prix championships. He was already a very well-known name. He'd been racing with Ferrari and Alfa Romeo. So the main thing he's remembered for, very fast, but perhaps overconfident to the point of being reckless, because several times he was involved in accidents that killed other drivers or spectators. He himself survived his racing career, though he was killed in a car accident in the Savoy Alps in 1966 while driving to the French Grand Prix. And he had a few injuries in races, but yeah, he was. Maybe it's symbolic of the mentality and the attitudes at the time, that he was extremely reckless but also just didn't care, even though everyone was aware of just how dangerous the racing was.
Yeah, I can't say that I know a lot about Farina's actual career. I know that he's the first F1 champion, that he was very aggressive. One thing to note is, his longevity, because he started racing in Grand Prix racing in 1935, and he was always up there. He never had the pace of Fangio or Ascari, and especially Ascari, from what I saw, used to outshine him in terms of this league of Italian drivers who kind of were always at the top of Grand Prix racing in the 40s and 30s. But he still is one of the most famous names in Formula One, just because he is the very first champion. Now, should he be in 29th? Frankly, I don't know. But yeah, for me, he was there, and I can't say I know too much about him.
I think 29th is around where I would put him, so I have to say I pretty much agree with the ranking on this one. It's also important to note with Farina that he was quite old when he was in F1. His championship year, he was 44, which, even for that time, it's still reasonably old for an F1 driver. I think one of the reasons I would leave him a little bit lower down was, number one, the Alfa Romeo car was very dominant in 1950, which gave him a bit of an edge. And number two, his only rival was Fangio, who was his teammate. And Fangio tended to outpace him, but it was just a bit of circumstance with Fangio's reliability was not there, whereas Farina's was. So I think that's one of the reasons I'd leave him a little bit lower on the list compared to some of the others.
That's a good point, because one thing I do remember is in 1950, a lot of people said that Alfa was favoring Farina a lot to become the first world champion, as it would happen at Monza. So when you think about that, Fangio could have been a 6-time world champion. He was definitely ahead of everyone else at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that 1950, he basically won that year because Fangio had retirements in Silverstone and Monza, and Farina won both of those races. Even though himself, he retired in Monaco, crashed out on the first lap when there was a wave that hit the circuit at Tabac, I think, which caused like a 10-car pileup, and he was caught in that. and then he was outside the points in France. But otherwise, yeah, he won it essentially on reliability. The main litmus test with him is that outside of that, compared to Fangio and Farid and Ascari, and that he was both teammates to, they both massively outperformed him. So those are ones you can make a direct comparison to. Also, he got 5 wins. He finished second 9 times. So a bit of a number 2 driver, dare I say. I think you could rank him maybe slightly higher than this, but yeah, he was I think he was past his best at this point. Definitely in the latter stages of his career, because he retired in 1956 when he failed to qualify for the Indy 500 and hadn't been in Formula One full time since 1953 before then. So yeah, definitely towards the end. So then 28th is Denny Hulme, the only champion from New Zealand. So Denny Hulme is mostly known for his being teammate and understudy, protege, employee, if you will, to Jack Brabham, but also beating Jack in his own car because he managed to take the title from him in 1967. He's won again as a one-time champion. He often gets he's easy to forget about. His results are actually fairly good because he was in Formula One for 9 years and got wins in almost every season he competed in. So he had a lot of longevity, but he was a quite reserved person. Didn't say much, didn't have a particularly big personality, but had a lot of longevity as a driver.
Yeah, and from what I see, he was quite aware on the racetrack. He wasn't one to get into a lot of incidents, which maybe goes against what we just said with Farina, who was always seen as being very aggressive. Hulme was also praised for constantly improving, so his pace always went up, which is kind of what you want with a good driver. And I would say it's a sign of a good driver if, every year you're finding these little few hundreds or tenths just to work your way up. So yeah, as you said, he is one of the most forgotten ones. I think on Sporkle, if you do the quiz about naming every single world champion, I think he is the least chosen pick. So he definitely gets forgotten a lot. But yeah, I would agree with him being 28th. He wasn't particularly impressive, but he was a good driver.
In my opinion, thinking of drivers still to come, I think Hulme could have been a couple places higher. I think a lot of this 28th position does reflect the fact that, like you said, most people just don't really remember him, which is a bit of a shame because I think it's a really interesting story. I was reading this the other day, that when he was brought into the Brabham team, he was never meant to be a world champion. He was brought into the team to be a solid, consistent second driver to lead driver Jack Brabham. So then in 67, whether it's, obviously there's going to be reliability as a factor back in the 60s, but he still managed to outperform Brabham in his own car and win the championship. That's not an easy feat, and I think it can get overlooked a little bit that actually he sort of won against the odds, and he was never meant to be a world champion, but became one, which in my mind is impressive.
Yeah, one thing is he was always better at races than qualifying. He only got 1 pole position with 8 race wins, which is always a good thing when you perform better on Sundays than Saturdays.
And a lot of his wins did come from quite far back on the grid as well. So yeah, definitely better on race pace, I think. So in 27th, we have Emerson Fittipaldi. I think, again, he does need to be higher. This is somebody who's kind of mastered racing on both sides of the Atlantic, got 2 drivers' titles. He's won the Indy 500. He's won the IndyCar Championship. And in Formula One, yeah, he was at first he was known for kind of being his youth really, because he won only his 3rd or 4th race when he was brought in as a replacement for the late Jochen Rindt. When he first won his title, he was the youngest Formula One champion at the time and remained that way for the next 33 years. I think, but with him, his biggest mistake was driving for the team that he founded with his brother, because he essentially wasted the last 5 or 6 seasons of his career in some very, very uncompetitive cars, having just left McLaren.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like in a lot of rankings he gets put lower than he should just because of that. And of course, that was a very big part of his F1 career. But his pace was incredible. From what I've seen in the 70s, he was also one of the precursors to Brazilians in Formula One, which is one of the main driving forces for Brazilians in Formula One, which obviously is such a big part of Formula One history now with all the other champions that came from there and all the other very good drivers. So he did a lot for a country, which I struggle to not consider when looking at these champions, because he did force his way in some way. When you did not have some national heritage in terms of Formula One history back then, you really, really had to overcome a lot of hurdles and barriers, which he did. And in terms of pure race pace, he was always seen in a very good light by all of his competitors, which is always the biggest compliment. So 27th is definitely too low for me, especially when you consider that in 1974, he was, I think, running in third with 2 races to go behind Regazzoni and Scheckter, and he had to overcome that deficit. So he's also one that didn't get easy championships.
I think, in my personal opinion, I agree with you guys in saying that he's too low on this list. And thinking of drivers yet to come, there's a couple that I would put behind him first. But to play devil's advocate, I think the one thing that, if I was Emerson Fittipaldi and I was thinking back on my career, the one thing I would have always wanted to do to sort of prove myself is properly beat Jackie Stewart. In 71, he'd lose the title to Jackie Stewart. In 72, they're fighting each other, and then Stewart becomes ill and misses out on a couple rounds, which is sort of what allowed Fittipaldi to then get the advantage and win the championship. And then 73, Stewart wins again and retires, leaving 74 kind of this open field of, well, who's going to take on the torch that's been passed on by Stewart's retirement? And then Fittipaldi did. I think if I was him, I would have had that hunger of going, I just really want to beat him once in a straight fight, me and him world championship battle. And I think he didn't get that, which is what maybe has caused them to knock him down a little bit in this ranking list.
Yeah, it's something that doesn't happen these days so much. Is when you get people that say, "Oh, a what if of if they should have won the title." Partly because of deaths, obviously, which are very rare now, but even just injuries or illness, it's very rare now for drivers to miss races because of those. Obviously, the last time that notable time that did happen was '99, and I think without Schumacher breaking his legs, he would have easily won the title that year. But yeah, that was always a factor that did kind of affect the destinies of a lot of drivers. But yeah, he went through a succession of 4 years alternating between first and second, and then he just threw that all away when he went to join Fittipaldi, because he did 5 seasons with that team / running it, and in that time got 2 podiums. So it just wasn't. It just wasn't worth it. And it was like Villeneuve, a lot of bad career moves basically tarnished his career.
Yeah, and for any listeners on Spotify, not on YouTube, we must say that this ranking we're looking at takes into account what engineers had to say about the drivers as well and their contributions into car development. And Fittipaldi was seen as someone who didn't really know how to work around his car. And his engineers said that it was a bit problematic the way he would try to work on his car. So that might be explaining a bit why the maker of this ranking put him so far down the list.
But I will say he did obviously, even after retiring, he showed he still had plenty left in the tank, because he had a very long career in IndyCar, as long, if not longer, than in Formula One. And he managed to win. He won the title in '89, by which point he would have been in his mid-40s. And then he finished runner-up 2 years in a row in the early '90s, around the age of 50. So yeah, still plenty left. And maybe he retired from F1. I mean, he was 30. He was mid-30s when he retired, so he could have gone on a bit longer, but probably just wanted to. He said at the time it was the stress of driving and running the team that he didn't want to have to do both at once. So then next up in 26th is Nigel Mansell. Again, I think this is too low. He was a driver that for years everyone was like, is he going to get this title? Because he had so many close calls, most notably in 1986. And then it does eventually come in 1992, only for him to then get dropped and then briefly return again and then flop with McLaren. Yeah, so a driver known for having an extremely aggressive driving style, which suited him well with active suspension, but not being someone that wanted to value consistency. He also had a lot of teammates. I mean, PK and Prost, he didn't get on particularly well with them. And he even basically said that Prost's 93 year, where he got his 4th title, is that Mansell had done all the work by helping develop the active suspension and everything, and then Prost just kind of reaps the benefits of it. Maybe I'm looking at it through, British tinted glasses, but it doesn't. I feel like he should be higher, really.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what Dan also has to say on this, because a lot of people say that Mansell is one of the biggest winners from British coverage of motorsport at the time and even nowadays, because he gets praised a lot, but analysts from other countries always say that, Mansell has always been seen as this incredible God-given skills, talented driver, when apparently he wasn't. So that's not something I know too much about, but I know that, he got criticized for this. Again, to the listeners on Spotify, it seems that in this ranking, the maker also looked a lot at attitude, and Mansell was known to have kind of a bad attitude, who got into fights with his teammates and his team in general, his engineers. So that might also be a reason. But I always saw Mansell as a very fast driver, which I think everyone will agree with. His purple patches and his standout races are incredibly impressive. So I would definitely have him higher than this. I know that we've said that about a lot of drivers now. We've said that about a lot of drivers so far, which is normal because we're just looking at the first few drivers. But Mansell 26 does not sit well with me.
I think I'm actually going to disagree with you two on this one. I think this is reasonably fair where they've put him. His career in the 80s, for me personally, it wasn't impressive enough. I think he should have been outperforming Keke Rosberg. And then realistically, I think in 87, he had a good shot at the title and just kind of couldn't put it together. And I don't know. It is tough because I do think part of that comes down to, I think British people like Mansell a lot. And I feel kind of bad saying this because I know he has a lot of fans, but I genuinely don't rate him that high. I think I rate him. He's a good driver, but not as highly as other people would. Just because I think he's a bit on and off. I don't think he was consistent enough in my mind.
Yeah, in this country, certainly, when you mention Mansell, most people will they'll think of Mansell Mania, they'll think of Red 5 on that Williams, they'll think of him winning in Silverstone and everyone storming the track and kind of crowding around the car. The thing is that when you look at his dominant year in 92, that year is more often remembered for great drives by Senna, and this is the same in 93 with Prost, who, rather than those two, because the car was so fast that Mansell was just cruising to victory each time, whereas Senna would get wins when he really shouldn't have, because he was having to extract so much more from a much more inferior car. And again in 93, and that kind of shows a lot of the difference. And another thing, I suppose, is 87, because that year he lost the title second year in a row. The first year, 86, him and teammate Nelson Piquet were basically scrapping around and taking points off one another and gave the title to Prost. And then 87, he crashed at the penultimate round and injured himself and had to sit out the last 2 races, but he was on the back foot already. But Piquet had basically, in a less disparaging way, had basically said that he wasn't, he was just blindly going for wins and not thinking about being consistent or not about risking crashing out, because he had 3 retirements from pole that year. But yeah, reckless. I think just popular because of how good the car was, and because he was this kind of larger than life personality, and also the first decent British driver we'd had for quite a long time. In the end. So then, in 25th, we have Mario Andretti. So Andretti is he's an interesting one because he's extremely well rounded as a driver, because he's very well decorated and has lots of accolades in Formula One and in America. He's won Indy, he's won a lot of the sports car endurance races. Extremely long career as well, and even today he's in his early 80s now, but he drove a Formula One car a couple of years ago, a modern one as well. He's still just bursting with energy. But yeah, extremely popular because he's got so much success in so many different disciplines. But in Formula One, yeah, mostly remembered his 1978 title-winning year in the Lotus 79 Black Beauty, the second car with ground effects, but the first one to really make use of it properly, that kind of brought on the aerodynamic revolution in Formula One.
Yeah, and his closest rival in 1978 died with 2 rounds to go when Andretti had the clear number 1 status in that car. Peterson was still always up there, if not beating him. So that's something that should always be taken into account, that he had the fastest car, but didn't win with that much dominance. His longevity is impressive because he got podiums in 1970 and 1969, and then he still got a podium in 1982 when he had to come back to help out. So he was definitely a fast driver, but his title-winning season was not convincing, and he's definitely more remembered for what he accomplished outside of Formula One.
I would have to say I agree ranking-wise roughly with this one. I think a testament to Mario Andretti being quite a good driver is that it took so much convincing for him to actually come into F1. He'd proven himself outside of F1 loads, being a really quick driver in multiple different series. And then he would come into F1 and kind of part-time, take part in a race here and there, but actually convincing him to be in F1 and race for a team and build up Lotus and then have that Lotus 79 and win with it. It took him a bit of convincing. I guess it was worthwhile in the end with him becoming champion. So I think at the time, a lot of people saw his potential to be world champion, which is why he's valid. He's a solid world champ. But yeah, ranking wise, around here seems fair enough.
Yeah, and one thing with Andretti is he was a very, very good qualifier. 18 pole positions is not something that you would get easily, especially back then. So his experience helped in that way, and his 1-lap pace was very, very good. But he didn't seem to, as Dan said, he didn't seem to care enough for long enough, say.
It took a long time for his career in a Formula One to get going, because he was 28 when he entered it. But he had a very interesting debut race, because it was Monza 1968, and he'd been offered the drive by Colin Chapman at Lotus. Turned up, he qualified well. What he then tried to do was fly back to America to compete in some dirt track race, and then was going to fly back again overnight to do the race in Monza. But they said, you can't do that. If you go back, you're not allowed to race. And he went back and did that race and wasn't allowed to start in Monza. And then came back 2 races later and got pole position for his first official start, although he didn't finish the race. But yeah, he was only running part-time, and he got a win with Ferrari in 71. It wasn't until 1975 that he actually went full-time into Formula One with Parnelli. And yeah, Lotus, I suppose, just kind of in the right place at the right time to go back to them when they introduced ground effects. But yeah, he was 42 when he eventually did leave Formula One, and then he won Le Mans in class in 1995 when he was in his mid-50s. So he just kept on going, really, and was still doing IndyCar into his 50s as well, having taken that title in 84. So yeah, just somebody. What I mean, a relatively unassuming Formula One record, but I'd say one of the most well decorated drivers in motorsport history, I think.
Purely going off F1, I think this is reasonable for where you would place him. But yeah, like you said, just being well-rounded driver overall, and I think he loved more racing than he actually cared about what series it was in. So I think that's why it was probably hard to tie him down to any one series. I think he just probably enjoyed driving as many cars as possible, which maybe meant that we didn't get his full potential in, for example, F1, but we did get some interesting sort of races in dirt track or IndyCar.
Yes.
Yeah, motorsports legend, maybe not Formula One legend.
Yeah. So then in 24th, we have Alan Jones. So he, again, there is overlap with Andretti. I mean, Jones's career started a bit later, and he didn't really get into a stride until after Andretti's was on its downfall. But Jones, yeah, he's known for being the first successful driver of Williams. He was their first title-winning driver. He has quite a sharp tongue, which you could expect from a lot of Aussies. Someone who needs to be censored a lot when he's in doing podcasts or interviews. Yeah, a good kind of scruffy, rough, old school driver that would just drive hard and fast. And yeah, but again, relatively brief, is that he had kind of a sandwich of okay first couple of years, then 3 very good years where he got 1 title, and then just not so good after that.
I think the struggle with Jones is that he joined a very early Williams. He had the title in 1980 where Williams sort of got it all together, got it right. And he looked, I think, very solid as a driver. Again, this ranking does represent well, I would say, what he managed to achieve in his career. But then he went through that period of Williams in sort of the mid-80s where they still weren't 100% sure on where to go. So I don't think the car was really there for him for a couple years. And then he was getting a bit older by the end of that and sort of moved on. So I think sometimes the machinery, I mean, you have to put machinery into the rankings, but this one especially, it kind of wasn't always in his favor, but definitely a deserving driver for a world championship, maybe not more than one.
Yeah, I think 24th is fair. I considered him being lower, but he had very good seasons between 1979 and 1981. We covered Jones a bit in the past as well on this podcast. Yeah, not much to add from what you guys said, but I would just keep him there. I think this is fair. I feel like he's more remembered for his quotes than his races, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing. But he was a good champion. Just I wouldn't really change anything from where he is.
Yeah, he like Andretti, he's another one that could be remembered for his longevity because his Formula One career was relatively short. But then afterwards, he did a lot of sports car racing, and he spent a long time in the Australian Touring Car Championship, and he was runner-up in 1993. By which point he was 47. And he didn't retire from professional racing until 2002, by which point he was 56 at that point. And that was over 20 years since he'd taken his Formula One title. So yeah, and today, yeah, still going strong. I mean, he's late 70s now. But yeah, another one that's got quite a long career and is relatively well decorated outside of Formula One.
I think a question to ask then is, we've talked about Button, Fittipaldi, maybe Mansell with you guys as well. We've said we should probably bring them higher. So Alan Jones, I guess, being one of the quieter world champs in terms of, I think people don't really remember him for his driving skill that much. He was still obviously a good enough driver to win the championship. But would you bring some of these other drivers ahead of Jones?
Yeah, definitely. That's the thing. That's why I was considering, should he go lower? But I wouldn't move him from 24th. But the thing is, with all the drivers that we've seen before him, there are definitely some that I would move ahead. So I'm not too sure how that would work in an actual ranking. But for example, yeah, Fittipaldi, I would definitely rank him higher than Jones. I'm not sure about Jenson Button, and that's why it becomes really weird. How do you compare Button to Jones? There's like 25 years of difference, 25 to 30 years between their primes. how do you compare them in terms of the cars they drove and the competition they faced? That's where rankings get quite convoluted.
Yeah, it's difficult because obviously before I mentioned that with Farina you can at least make direct comparisons with Fangio and Ascari, and with Jones you can compare him to Andretti, Scheckter, PK, Lauda, just the other drivers around that time. That's usually a good starting point, but he's kind of on the lower end of those ones, I think. Oh boy, so 23rd, Sebastian Vettel. This is criminal, I think. So, for my case, I don't want people to look at his title winning years. I want everyone to look at what he did in 2008 and 2015. When he was on, 2015, certainly on the back foot, having the second best car against an indomitable Mercedes in what was an extremely boring year, where he still managed to win 3 races, got a large smattering of podiums. And when Lewis did claim the title in America, he was actually ahead of Rosberg in the standings. And until a few races before, his tyre blowout in Belgium took him out of... Before that, he was within touching distance of the title in a car that really shouldn't have done it. And 2008 was absolutely stunning. I don't know why that car ended up being so good, because it was just the Red Bull with a year-old Ferrari engine, and it ended up being obviously the better car. Bourdais, not really designed for Formula Ones, and he had a lot of bad luck. But Vettel, he takes the win in Monza, very consistent, lots of points finishes that really shouldn't be doing that. So off of that, we knew he was going to do well, and obviously he did with his 4 championships, 2 of which he dominated and 2 of which went down to the wire, and he still came out on top.
I think with Vettel in this ranking, there's been a bit of recency bias, because I think there's always the argument that Vettel was maybe slightly more mistake prone than Hamilton or Schumacher or Alonso that you would often compare him to. But you don't win 4 championships by mistake, and by no means with Mark Webber as your teammate, who I think by that point had solidified himself as a strong driver, maybe not championship worthy, but strong enough to be a contender. I think the 2 things that they seem to have taken massively into account here is Daniel Ricciardo outpacing him in 2014, which you could probably argue is prime Daniel Ricciardo around that era. And then obviously how close he was to Stroll in comparison to how close Alonso is to Stroll now. I think Vettel suffered more of a drop-off towards the end of his career than we've seen with Alonso or Hamilton. But to put him 23rd, like you said, for a 4-time world champion, it's definitely too low.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I have always said that Vettel, he has been overrated in rankings for a lot of people because of his championships. A lot of people would say he was top 5, and I don't think he is top 5 all time at all. But 23rd is, criminal. You cannot put a driver who is that fast that low in a world champions ranking, especially because when he won, because we tried to talk about the times he didn't win, both of you 2 did that, but when he was winning, it was scary, because that is the main thing for what he was remembered for. 2011 and 2013, those dominant wins were insane. Obviously, that's helped by the car, by Webber starting to fall off a bit after 2010, but it was just incredible. 2008, again, fantastic season, and I always use the Daniel Ricciardo season against Vettel, but it's not like it fully destroyed him in a way that he should have 22 world champions ranked above him. And about the Lance Stroll teammate era, it's so obvious to me that Vettel didn't care anymore. And I don't know how that's not taken into account in this ranking, especially in 2022. The number of times that in quali, Vettel would just half-ass a lap and then would always complain on the radio that, oh, I'm out in Q1 again, but it wasn't like he was completely frustrated as well. It was obvious that he didn't have his mind into F1 anymore. And you have to remember that he was one of the most dominant drivers against a very stacked field. In 2012, for example, yes, everyone remembers Alonso for it, rightly so. But Vettel still had to complete 2 incredible comeback drives to win that championship. In Abu Dhabi and in Brazil, as dominant as that car was, as fast as that car was, he still had to do a job there. The title wasn't given to him at all.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I could go on for forever about this. I'll try and give the TLDR. So during his championship winning years, I was surrounded by, British fans who were all supporting Hamilton, Button, and McLaren. They would always say that, Vettel can only lead from the front and he can't overtake and he can't battle with anyone. And they would point at things like Turkey 2010 or Belgium 2010. They would ignore races like Brazil 2012 is a good example, Abu Dhabi 2012, where he came from the pit lane and finished third. Even later on, wet races like Germany 2019, he finished second. He started 20th. He was the only driver the entire race who didn't spin or go off track once. And he repeated this, Turkey 2020, again, the only driver with no offs, and he finishes third in an absolutely awful car. He started 11th and he got to third on the first lap. Like, obviously knew what he was doing. Always been an excellent wet weather driver. His first win was in the wet. People will say, because of Germany 2018, that was one error. That's why he's not a good wet weather driver. And yeah, I think the hybrid era cars generally just did not suit him so well because they had so little torque. They'd like to spin, and he was someone who liked a really, really solid rear end, and that's what the Red Bulls are built with by having these really good diffusers. And he just didn't have that when the spinning phases start. And there was the aerodynamics were clearly messed up on those cars because he would T-bone somebody and he would spin and they would be fine. And it's the other way around. So there was something funny going on with those Ferraris. But with Aston Martin, 22 especially, he obviously stopped caring because by this point he was really into like save the bees and all the environmentalism and all of that stuff, and drawing more attention to that than the racing. And you saw this Austria, where he was being interviewed in the media pen after the race, and he was then told he had a time penalty for track limits, and he was now last, and he just looked at them, he's like, doesn't matter, and just didn't care because he was outside the points. But even then, like Azerbaijan 21, that was a perfectly good race. He finished second in that one. Hungary would have finished second without the disqualifications. There were still the odd flashes, but yeah, you can tell when a driver has just kind of given up and stopped and stopped caring. And he's had several years of being battered by Ferrari and Hamilton. But yeah, he knew what he's doing. Excellent qualifier, always really good at breaking ahead and getting out of DRS range, and then just being fine for the rest of the race, basically. And
as we're about to sort of move on from Vettel, I think what would be really cool to do is, if I'm going to ask you guys this question, when we get to somewhere you feel suitable to put Vettel, just say, because I really want to know where you would sort of end up ranking Vettel, because like you said, I don't think he can crack into that top 5, but he does need to be higher than 23rd. So I'll be curious to know where roughly you'd put him when we see some of the other drivers.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say about having him 23rd is it's such an insult to all of his other competitors. Having him 23rd is such an insult to Alonso, to Button, to Hamilton, because that's basically saying, oh yeah, all of you guys, you got beaten by this incredibly bad world champion, which he just was not. He was so fast, so dominant. And I really want to just mention what Peter said on his pins. There was definitely a thing with him and the new cars because he wasn't one to spin in the V8 era. And then come 2014, he's spinning for no reason. He's applying throttle in a weird way that doesn't suit the car. And then, he just sends the car somewhere. There's that race in Hungary it's 2014, right? Where he just spins out of the last corner and then he just catches it before it hits the wall. That was so useless to happen, but it's not. I wouldn't say that was his fault, and I think that was the biggest, the biggest sign of him not liking those cars.
And I think also just the general change in the meta, if you want to call it that we went away from aero and diffusers to engines. And Renault had a useless engine, and they always had this in the Red Bull years, and that was always their weakness, was that Mercedes, Ferrari had much better engines, but they had really good aero. And now the 2014 Red Bull, perfectly good aero, but useless power unit compared to what Mercedes had. And depending on the engine so much, just didn't work so well for him. So then 22nd, we have Mika Hakkinen. This again, I think, is a bit mean. Mika is an extremely popular driver. His rivalry with Schumacher is very, very well. People are very fond of it. It's very well remembered. 98 was a fantastic year. It took a long time for him to get going because he had several years with Lotus and then went to McLaren. But early years there were a lot of dodgy races. 99 really does not put him in a good light, though. I'll be honest, because he made so many mistakes and almost lost the title to Eddie Irvine of all people in a year when he would have been completely bodied by Schumacher if Schumacher hadn't broken his legs. But yeah, they remember like Spa 2000 and just him and just the rival with Schumacher. But this, I think you could move him up a little bit higher.
Yeah, I agree. I think a touch higher would be fair to Mika Hakkinen. You've got to remember what Schumacher would always say about him as well, is that he was like genuinely a very strong rival to Schumacher. So to have him quite low, I guess, is a testament to go, well, are you sort of saying that Schumacher doesn't know what he's on about when it comes to F1 drivers? I don't think he would be too much higher because I would agree that maybe Mika Hakkinen had quite a short prime. You know, you hear it, think of him from 1998, 1999, 2000 battling with Schumacher. And then it's very quickly into like 2002, 2003 when Kimi replaces him. And it's like, oh, where did he sort of just disappear? But yeah, I think a short prime, but an incredibly fast driver. And everyone thinks of that that overtake where Schumacher and him are racing, going to lap a car, and then he just sends it down the inside and makes the move happen. And that's just sort of the driver he was, just bold and brave.
Yeah, Mika Hakkinen really opens up the discussion in this podcast about how are we considering drivers with very high primes and how are we comparing it to drivers with maybe longer, more consistent careers. Because yeah, Mika, you want to put him higher, but that would be only considering prime Mika, who was very, very fast. I know that Ciaron, if he was here, he would have put him much higher probably than any of us. But if you look at his entire career, yes, I would have him higher, but like only by 2 or 3 rankings. One of the things that always gets brought up is how he was close to Senna when he had his debut, but you can't only be using this for a driver every time. One thing that you can use is Schumacher really praising Hakkinen a lot as his main rival. But yeah, he is very hard to rank. He is a driver that a lot of people will have him around 20th in such a ranking, and some people remember him very fondly as a top 10 driver.
It just, yeah, obviously really, really fast driver, but just, I think mentally he did crack. Even though the Finnish are usually known for being very stoic and kind of aloof and nonchalant. Because I aforementioned 99, how close he came to throwing that title away. 2000 was good. Obviously, it just didn't quite. It was closer with Ferrari. It just didn't quite fall his way in the end. But 2001 was not brilliant. He got very much outclassed by Coulthard that year. The Senna thing's interesting because they only spent 3 races as teammates, and he only finished one of those. But yeah, the early career, it was kind of leaning onto sort of Valtteri Bottas territory. We were like, oh, there's some promise there, and put him in a good car, and maybe he'll do all right. And obviously, he exceeded the expectations of someone like Bottas would have. But yeah, just very popular driver from a nostalgia perspective, and his kind of stone cold personality and everything is what a lot of people remember. 21st, James Hunt, or Hunt the Shunt, if you want another name for him. He's someone that more recent fans, if they've seen Rush, that will give them a good impression of what he was like. Extremely prolific womanizer that did some racing on the side. Obviously, yeah, 1976 wins the title against Lauda. Probably should not have won it because obviously Lauda missed 3 races because his near fatal accident. Relatively short career in Formula One as well. And but he had the speed when he needed it, but most people will just remember him as a playboy, party boy, kind of serial womanizer, pretty much.
This is where I do think, ranking wise, it's criminal to have him ahead of Fittipaldi, because at the end of the day, you're right. If Lauda hadn't have suffered that accident, Hunt would not have won in 1976. And then you think, well, he didn't win before that, and you think to after it, where he was sort of retired from F1 pretty soon after. Did he have one more season? Was it in F1 and then left, or a couple more?
Two and a half. Mid 79, he gave up.
So realistically, then, if it wasn't for Lauda's accident, he probably wouldn't have been an F1 champion. And I think this is another one where it's maybe recency bias of seeing Rush and having it come out, and obviously main character in there. But when you actually think race pace wise, I don't think he actually would have been champion if it weren't for Lauda's bad luck. I mean, then again, though, to finish first you have to finish. So feel free to disagree.
See, here I fully agree with you guys. However, I'm just looking at some of the arguments that are on the slides. The fact that in 1976, there were weird things going on for him as well. He was DSQ'd in Britain, and then in Monza, the officials were against him. And Dan, for example, you mentioned Fittipaldi. I would always have Fittipaldi higher than Hunt, but it's mentioned on the slide that he was much better than Fittipaldi in terms of pace, and also was faster than Jochen Mass in qualifying, which are not things I had really considered. What would you say in terms of those small little stats and this analysis of his actual pace?
I think Formula One is unfair. It isn't pace based at the end of the day. You can be faster than someone in qualifying, you can be faster than them in the race, but if you're not putting together everything, then you aren't an F1 champion. And it's about your strategy. It's about how you think yourself through the race. It's about managing risk. And Hunt was quick, but I don't know if he had all those other factors that make up a champion. Whereas I think someone like Fittipaldi, for example, yes, he was quick. Maybe he got outdone by Hunt, but he was also smart in that he drove a clever race and he managed, and that's how he found more success. Whereas just being quick doesn't always equal being championship worthy.
Yeah, he had speed, but not really much else. That was the thing. He didn't have very good technical understanding. Racecraft, it's hard to say, but just the results. I mean, in his entire racing career, the only title he got was in '76. He didn't win any titles in his junior career. He didn't come anywhere near winning it, and he had very few wins actually in anything. And yeah, after he retired in mid '79, obviously at that point he went into commentary, which is how a lot of other people remember him. Is that throughout the 1980s, him co-commentating alongside Murray Walker and usually being very disparaging to drivers he didn't like, which maybe would be if only the modern commentators could get away with that, it could be very entertaining. But yeah, he did 2 races in Interserie in 1992, and then the following year he was dead, which is again another live fast, die young kind of approach that he had, and a very mostly remembered, not really remembered so much as a driver, but remembered for his very distinctive personality traits.
Yeah, one thing that's noted on the side is that he maybe has the best qualifying record against teammates of all time. That's also helped by the fact that most of his teammates were very lackluster, but yeah, he was fast, and no one will ever go against that and disagree with you. But he is the first driver I think I can actually say I would have lower in this ranking.
Yeah. So top 20, and it's Kimi. Oof, and more oof. Where's Ciaron when you need him?
Exactly.
Yeah, so Kimi is one that, for most of the time I've been watching Formula One, I never really liked him that much because everyone loves him because he says nothing and just doesn't seem to care and just does whatever he wants. But what I never liked about him was that because I never really watched Formula One during his McLaren era when he was obviously at his best, and I saw him after that when he had definitely fallen off a cliff, and he just felt very like he didn't care, very aloof, like he didn't want to be there, and also very ungrateful for being in such a privileged position. But yeah, his McLaren years, insanely fast, so much bad luck and so many setbacks that took away 2 titles that he should have easily won. You can even if you look at all the alleged espionage and sabotage going on in 2008, you could make a case for a 4th title. People have attempted to make the case for him winning 2012. I don't really see how you can make that case since he won 1 race. Yeah, but again, most experienced driver in Formula 1 history, relatively good career record, but just things didn't land in the way that they maybe should have.
It's interesting with Kimi because I think I would do 2 separate rankings for 2009 and pre-Kimi and then 2012 and onwards Kimi, because it was like seeing maybe 2 different drivers. You already touched mostly on the McLaren stuff, like you said, extremely unlucky for the most part. I think it was over a 30% retirement rate for him during some of those seasons, which is just insane. But then touching on maybe his latter career, there's rumors and quotes from people who've worked at Lotus that they think if they'd had Alonso or Hamilton in that Lotus car, it would have been the best car on the grid. And they think that actually it wasn't Kimi being extremely fast. It was more the Lotus flattering Kimi. And then when you look at gaps, you can sort of make a case for this in the fact that gap between Hamilton and Button was about 2 or 3 tenths in Hamilton's favor. Gap between Alonso and Massa was about 2 or 3 tenths. Gap between Grosjean and Kimi in race pace was, I think, pretty much equal. And I don't think anyone would rate Roman Grosjean as anywhere near Kimi Räikkönen's prime. So it's a rumor. It's very out there, but what do you think?
Well, I hope Ciaron is not listening to this because he always says that 2012 and 2013 Kimi were extremely fast. And I know that he also has a view that in 2018, if Ferrari had put Kimi as number 1 driver and Vettel as number 2 driver, Kimi could have won the title, which again, I'm looking forward to what you think about that, Dan. But yeah, Kimi, again, as a younger fan, I guess that I didn't really appreciate how fast he was because I really got into F1 in 2007 and after. And Kimi has really been praised for his 2003 to 2007 pace, especially 2003 to 2005. Many people have called him the fastest driver they worked with, or the most impressive driver in terms of raw pace that they witnessed. And yeah, like looking back at some of his races, it's extremely impressive. In 2005, he would have won the title perhaps easily if McLaren was more reliable. Now, having him in 20th is outrageous because he was very fast, he was consistent. I think his 2014 season where, he got kind of smashed by Alonso in terms of points, especially, looks very bad on him when you're looking at him compared to his teammates and in the cars that he drove. He would definitely break into the top 15 for me. Maybe towards 12th or 11th, but he cannot be 20th. And I think that 2014 season makes him look extremely bad.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting assertion that he could have, if they just favoured him in 2018, he would have won the title. Yeah, not against Lewis. I mean, 2018 Lewis is pretty much the strongest that we've seen from him. So even without Vettel spinning all the time, it was a tall order. It would have been a very, very close battle. But Kimi, it just wasn't there. Like, he got 1 pole position on a very lucky toe, and that pole position ended up jeopardizing Vettel's title quite severely. And he got 1 win in America, which he almost lost to Verstappen. But it just wasn't the pace just wasn't there. I mean, admittedly, they would sometimes forget to pit him. They keep doing one stops, and they're like, oh, we were meant to pit him again at some point, and just didn't. But they were teammates for 4 years, and he never came anywhere near Vettel in that time. So and the 2014, I mean, it was an awful car. It looked like a Hoover. Wasn't brilliant again against Alonso. He just had several years in a row of getting beaten by other champion teammates, and there's not much to take from his Alfa Romeo years. I mean, he cared even less. I mean, Alfa Romeo or Kick or whatever they're called now, they're just a retirement home for drivers. Yeah, the odd good race where he had an amazing start, but otherwise it's just like, yeah, whatever. It's just a shame, yeah, things didn't land earlier on. As in my eyes, he is the rightful champion in 2005. That's the way I see it, because Alonso never had any breakdowns and had an extremely easy run to it because of that McLaren's engine.
Yeah, in my opinion, he is the rightful winner for 2003. Maybe not 5 for obvious reasons, because in 2003 he was extremely impressive as well, and then also got unlucky towards the end. I must say that in 2013 we were meant to have a much closer title fight between Vettel, Alonso, and Raikkonen, but after Silverstone, when Pirelli decided to change the tires, it severely hampered Ferrari and Lotus, and then Red Bull had it really nailed down. So in an alternate world, we could have had a much closer Kimi and Alonso to Vettel in 2013, who we just looked at as well. And Kimi could have been remembered in a much better light by, I'd say, the wider fan base. It's also interesting to wonder if Kimi had been fighting for the title in 2013, then obviously the salary issues pop up. What happens? So yeah, those are two things for Dan to consider. Would he have been able to win in 2018, and would he have been able to win in 2013 as well?
It's really interesting, and to be honest, I don't know if I would agree with the theory myself, like completely. I quite like Raikkonen, and I think with these what if scenarios, we'll never know unless it actually happens at the end of the day. And even if mechanics are saying things like Hamilton or Alonso could have won this title with our car, again, you just never know. 2018 is an interesting one, saying that Kimi could have outpaced Vettel. I think what I also got thinking about when you said that was, looking at this ranking list, they've now placed Raikkonen above Vettel, which is interesting considering throughout the Ferrari years, Vettel would obviously always be quicker than Raikkonen. You can make the case that that was Ferrari's fault, but I'll be curious to see whether you guys would be placing Vettel anywhere closer, if not higher than Raikkonen, given that, or if maybe we look, well, Kimi 2003 to 5 was just immensely fast.
I mean, for me, Vettel is obviously higher. Just there's more consistent. Both drivers had setbacks of different natures, often some of them relating to reliability or just having cars that didn't work for them. But Vettel his statistics are far better. He just delivered more consistently than Raikkonen. Also showed, in terms of general attitude, is that you could see that Vettel cared more. And this is a problem that Raikkonen had in terms of his personality traits, which people like about him, is that he just didn't, a lot of the time, he just didn't look like he was trying. And there have been engineers in the past who have said, particularly when he was teammates with Alonso, that Kimi would put in the minimal effort, whereas Alonso was giving 100% all day, every day. Yeah, I think he could have, and because he wouldn't even if things were against him in terms of sabotage and having cars that didn't work, he didn't speak up and complain about it. So it's hard to say if maybe he just didn't want to be seen as a complainer or didn't want to admit what the real problems were. I don't know, but yeah, he should definitely be below Vettel. They should both be higher, but Vettel more higher.
In my opinion, I mean, I find it hard between those two because I have been brainwashed by Ciaron's recent rhetoric on Kimi. I still would put Vettel higher because you still have to perform even if you have the car, and he did. He maybe got lucky that there wasn't as much competition, but you don't win 4 titles just like that. And I know that Kimi in an alternate timeline, he could have easily won 3 titles, but it's, yeah, at the end of the day, it's just a lot of what ifs.
So in 19th, we have Niki Lauda. So Niki, another one people remember, well, anyone who's watched Rush will remember him, and has very, very different personality and approach to racing that he had to James Hunt. Very, very, very good technical understanding. Again, always well-rounded, always really fully committed. His main claim to fame is his crash in 76 that left him with permanent disfigurements. A bit of a mid-season retirement, but then he came back and won a 3rd title. So just, yeah, very, very well-rounded driver again. And very highly regarded, one of the most popular Ferrari drivers and one of their most successful ones too, who just in his prime couldn't really be touched.
Yeah, I would have him higher, and I know we've been saying that for a lot of drivers, but Lauda is very underrated for me. I think he is, well, in this ranking, he was very good in an era where it wasn't easy to win. It wasn't the most competitive era, but you still had to power through, and he did. And especially his win in 1984, I think, is really, really impressive, because against Prost, obviously he only won by half a point, but that was so impressive. When you look at the results, when you look at the pace, Prost was incredible in the 80s, and beating him should really be praised. So without going too much into detail for his 70s, just 1984 deserves a lot of praise from me.
I agree. Niki Lauda is, I would have to say, he's probably one of those where if you're looking for the ultimate F1 driver, Niki Lauda ticks all the boxes. Pace-wise, always seemed decent, always seemed reasonably fast, but also his understanding of the car and mechanics, it felt like he can give very good, workable feedback, and therefore was able to push car development forward, which is, I think, really important in F1. And then longevity being the third one, obviously. Winning his first title in 1975, then 9 years later winning another, that is very impressive, especially at that era in Formula One. So, yeah, beating Prost as well, even if it is by half a point, you can say circumstance, but at the end of the day, he did it, and he is possibly one of those pinnacle of F1 drivers. This ticks all the boxes, exactly what you want. Very deserved 3-time world champion.
Yeah, when he died in 2019, just before the Monaco Grand Prix, and so at that race there were a lot of tributes, mostly from Mercedes. They were giving because at the time he'd been working for them, they were giving never-ending praise to him for being a good advisor and consultant. And I was thinking, really, because what I remember about him is coming back from the brink of death and winning 3 championships. Nobody remembers his work as a consultant for Mercedes. In the same way that he's not really remembered for being his short term as team principal for Jaguar 20 years ago. It gets a bit diluted, I think, because he was he was in the paddock all the time. It sort of took away an element of the mystique compared to the champions that you don't see that often at races or don't make many media appearances. It was like, oh, it's Lauda again, but you end up forgetting his accolades and the fact that really he should have 4 titles, because 76 should have gone to him. And a driver again who came from a relatively ordinary background. He had to take out quite a significant loan in order to get his first drive with BRM to get into Formula One. Obviously, once he made it with Ferrari, he was sorted. But yeah, he does need to be higher. And I think people need to look at they need to remember his whole career at Narge and not just what happened at the Nürburgring in 1976.
I think this ranking, again, it uses a lot of analytics in terms of teammates as well. And the fact that he was matched by rookie Nelson Piquet in 1979 seems to have made Lauda go down to 19th, which is, it's a bit surprising. It must be said that he was so good in terms of being methodical and race-based, in terms of looking at his race pace in 1984, that he shaped a lot what Alain Prost became. And that's, again, a lot of praise should be going towards that, because in 1984, Prost was much faster than Lauda. I think everyone could agree with that. Lauda was at the tail end of his career. Prost was entering the prime of his career and was generally a very fast driver. But Prost saw how smart and shrewd Lauda was about everything. And then Prost came to become that driver when he was with McLaren, with Senna. So yeah, Lauda definitely higher for me.
Yeah. So in 18th, Jack Brabham. So now we're jumping back to the 60s for the first time in quite a while. Again, another three-time champion. He last surviving driver from the 1950s. Only driver to win a title in a car he designed himself. Yeah, he was already fairly old when he entered Formula 1. He was already in his 30s by that point. But yeah, just always an authoritative figure. Very good driver. Yeah, just very, very, very well remembered, and a lot of longevity in both racing and his life in general.
Yeah, Brabham's an interesting one. If we're thinking about rankings, I don't know if I'd put him ahead of Niki Lauda, because as good as Brabham was, I think sometimes maybe down to circumstance. I mean, he did beat out Sterling Moss, which is by no means a small feat. But then 1967, you think, well, there was the whole thing with Denny Hulme beating him in his own car. Isn't the best look. But then longevity-wise, even to his last season in 70, he was still winning races and fighting for wins. And we talked about, obviously, 1970 and Brabham quite a bit. So I'm just going to bring some of that back here, in that it was only at the end of that 70 season where reliability started to affect him, and he seemed to fall off a little bit pace-wise, not really being able to score any points. But he drove against some really, really talented drivers too. And yeah, I think Brabham, a solid 18, definitely. But thinking back to some other drivers that we've ranked, definitely, for example, Lauda, I would put Lauda ahead of Brabham.
Yeah, I would also put Brabham a bit lower, and I feel like some people might think it's a bit unfair, because three-time world champion, especially at that time, building your own car, just, making your own legacy in some way, winning in your own car, which is incredible. But yeah, it feels harsh, but we do have to put some drivers lower if we're having so many drivers move. So at least personally, I would have him lower for, well, most of the reasons you guys said. He had a very long career, that's for sure, and that should be praised. In 1970, winning at the age of 44, winning race at the age of 43 or 44 is very impressive against a very strong grid. But yeah, 1967 does hold quite badly in my view.
Yeah, he's from a different generation of drivers when a lot of them were mechanics and engineers on the side, obviously. And he became the patriarch of a sort of motorsport dynasty, because he had two sons, one remembered for his very kind of congenial and leadership qualities in 94, and the other one remembered for less savory reasons. Yeah, but very, very big name in kind of Australian motorsport, and he was definitely one of the better drivers in the 60s, considering how many good drivers there were that year, and also his age. But this is maybe, even with the three titles, maybe this is a fair ranking, I think, considering the caliber of drivers that we have as champions. 17th, so once again, a bit of a recap to our last episode, Jochen Rindt. So we covered him to death in the previous episode, looking at 1970. First and so far only posthumous world champion. Because of his untimely death, his career record is maybe not as good as it should be, and he's a lot shorter than it should be. But, won Le Mans, very good in Formula 2, did a lot of Formula 2 races on the side, really dominant 1970, but yeah, it was just cut short with his death in Monza.
We touched on this at the end of last episode, and I think what we said he had the potential to have been, we called it S-tier driver, a top-tier driver, and I would guess a top 20 driver. But what we didn't see is he was in a slow car for the early stages of career, and then 69, he had that Lotus that had pretty terrible reliability, but put up a good challenge to Stewart. Then 70, he works with Chapman. They kind of get it all together. They get the Lotus 72, and he wins the championship, but unfortunately passes away that season. And Nav, you summed it up perfectly at the end of last episode, which was he's a very good driver, but we didn't see enough of him to really be able to tell. And if he'd been in F1 for longer, I would possibly agree with this ranking. If he'd, maybe secured a couple other championships, you think he would be in the place of Fittipaldi? Would he have made that Lotus work against Stewart? Who knows? It's another what-if scenario. But thinking back to Vettel, thinking back to Lauda, thinking back to even probably Brabham, I would place ahead of him. That's not to discredit him. That's just to say, I think in the grand scheme of things, he's a little bit too high at the moment.
Yeah, he was a very good driver, but you have to consider the untimely death, and it's hard to put him that high compared to drivers who had longer careers, who had more accomplished careers. That's not Rin's fault, but that's the case, sadly, because otherwise, you would, when considering other drivers from that era, you would have to change rankings depending on when they died and when they couldn't perform more than they could have because of injuries and stuff. So yeah, Rin, I guess he's fine at 17th, but because again of the other names you have mentioned, he would probably be going a bit lower. You just cannot forget that his career was cut short, and sadly in such a ranking, that goes against you.
So in 16th, we have Nelson Piquet. So these days, Piquet is remembered for basically not mincing his words and liking to run his mouth off track. I think a lot of the people that tend to criticize him, and you can see this from the way they talk about him, I don't think they actually know who he is, or they know very little about him. But when it comes to his on-track antics, he won 3 titles in the 1980s, all in the turbo era. Extremely fast driver, one of the most well decorated when you consider that he lived in an era before stat inflation was really a thing you could achieve, since most of his cars didn't work very well. Yeah, but just a very, very abrasive personality, not someone not someone you could get on with easily, and did kind of make himself a bit of an outcast in the end. I mean, now he's now banned from the paddock, and he lost his honorary membership with the British Racing Drivers Club. I can't imagine he's going to appear on Beyond the Grid anytime soon. He's just kind of living in sort of exile in Brazil. But yeah, one of the stars of the 1980s, and a lot going for him as a driver.
That 1987 World Championship is one you've got to point to it as being impressive, because you think of the caliber of driver he was racing against then. You've got Nigel Mansell fighting him. You've got Alan Prost in pretty much his prime. You've got Ayrton Senna about to enter his prime on the grid. To beat out all of those guys and be the world champion that season in what I don't think he ever really had an overly dominant car. He was a very good driver, and I know people will bash him now because of what he says, but in this situation, you've got to separate art from artist, and objectively, Piquet was a very, very good driver in a time in F1 where I think a lot of the cars were also extremely close.
Yeah, and his accident in 1987 is also a moment you can point out as a pre-accident Piquet and a post-accident Piquet, because pre-accident Piquet, many saw him as faster than Mansell, many saw him as the fastest driver in Formula One at that point. He was also always praised by the engineers, by his team, for working extremely, extremely hard, something that Mansell was not fond of doing at all. So, yeah, as a driver, he was very good. The thing is, we always go back to talking about how he is as a personality nowadays, which is a very bad one. But as a driver, 16th is fair. It's even a bit harsh because he was extremely fast. But the thing is, we have had even faster drivers. But I'm sure that maybe some older fans who maybe witnessed Piquet when they were teenagers or even when they were young adults must be thinking, yeah, PK breaks into the top 10, and I don't think I would be able to disagree with that either.
Yeah, the 80s, it was a decade of excess when it came to car design, and the 86 and 87 Williams were particularly extreme in terms of power output, and you can see this when you watch laps of him going around Monaco with those things. I mean, those are the ones that were hitting about 1400 horsepower in qualifying, and also had the aerodynamics to make them so dominant, even if they did like to blow up a bit. But yeah, his accident that meant he basically lost his depth perception, it did affect him, and he admitted it affected him. But even with that, things are still fairly good. I mean, the 2 years of Lotus were not brilliant because those cars were absolutely terrible. But the Benetton years were actually quite decent because he picked up a few wins and was still driving well considering it was towards the end of his career. And those cars had good aero, but they were missing out on not having still having a manual gearbox and a few other things that were just a bit behind the times. But yeah, there was a lot. It's a really good career, very good driver. It's just been tarnished by his attitude and his values as well. But it's a shame because I give high praise to anyone who raced in the 1980s, and especially anyone that won 3 championships. So in 15th we have Jody Scheckter. So I'm quite fond of Scheckter, but even for me, this is a bit generous. So in his career, in the first couple of years of his career, he was mostly known for causing a lot of quite big accidents and drawing the ire of some of the more seasoned drivers, particularly Fittipaldi. And he famously caused a 13-car pileup at Silverstone in 1973. But then around 75, 76, he kind of sorted himself out. And then in 76, I think it was, or 77, he took the only win for a 6-wheeled car with the Tyrrell 6-wheeler. He won with Wolf on their debut race, and then he takes the title in 1979, which for me is a classic example of brawn over brain, or brain over brawn, against Gilles Villeneuve, because Gilles Villeneuve basically drove the car to bits, and it broke a lot, whereas Scheckter was more measured and controlled, and having consistency and reliability, managed to take his title, even if his title defense in 80 was abominable.
This is one I'm going to straight up say I disagree with the ranking quite a bit, and there's a lot of drivers I think should deservedly go ahead of Scheckter. Now, I don't really know if 79 was his for the taking. When he came into Ferrari for 79, he signed a contract that basically gave him outright, he's the first driver, priority over Villeneuve. In the first few races of the season, Villeneuve outmatches him quite a lot. And Ferrari basically go up to him and go, look, you've got till Monaco to sort this out, or we're prioritizing Gilles for the championship. He does. He convincingly wins in Belgium. And then that Monaco race, I believe it was an absolutely amazing win for him. And from there, he does start to pick up the pace, pick up more points. But in the last race of the season, team orders were in place for Villeneuve to not beat Scheckter, and he takes the championship, which in my mind is sort of worrying because, like, I don't know, maybe 74, maybe 77 was his year instead. And if he won, then I wouldn't be saying this. But I think 15th is too high when you've got Vettel, Raikkonen, PK, Lauda, Brabham all behind Scheckter. I think he needs pushing down a couple places.
Yeah, I think at least 10 spots he needs to go down. Again, the one, and I've said this before, the obvious comparisons are Andretti, Hunt, and Jones, all one-time champions, like late 70s, early 80s, all raced alongside each other. Those are the ones that it's easy enough to make the comparisons with. I think a lot, again, he's one of the less well-remembered drivers because outside of Formula One, he didn't do any other racing. When he left Formula One in 1980, he never raced again in anything, and he went into business, and now he runs a farm in Hampshire. So he's gone. Yeah, he wasn't. His racing career was relatively brief. As a professional career, it lasted for less than 10 years. But yeah, the 70, you do have to give him some credit in 77 and 74, because 74, that was his first full-time year, and he finishes third and gets 2 wins. And 77, it's a brand new team, and he finishes runner-up, even though he was still quite far behind Lauda, who had just dominated it. And the 76 car is just fun because it's the six-wheeler, and he said he wasn't a huge fan of it, but still managed to win a race in it. But he's just now I like him because he does a lot of media appearances and interviews, and he's bought almost every car he races with, and he keeps them in a barn in his farm, and he'll bring them out to Goodwood and other events like that every so often. Which is it's just nice to kind of keep those relics from the era.
Driving that 1976 car must have been difficult, the six-wheeled one. I mean, we know in 76 it was obviously a reasonably good car and dropped off more the next year. But I do think 79, looking back at it, maybe if it had been an even title fight and he hadn't had priority, it wouldn't have been an easy win for Scheckter, or maybe wouldn't have been a win at all. It would have been Villeneuve's. But then, as you say, when you go back to some of the previous seasons, he definitely had that world champion's pace. And I guess that's Formula One, isn't it? Formula One's unfair. He is a champion, but yeah, like you said, maybe 10 or so spots further down, but still a good enough driver in his own right.
Yeah, I think he's been asked about the Tyrrell, and I think the main things he said was it broke a lot. The brakes got very hot, but it had so much front end grip, and you could just throw it into the corner, and it wouldn't run wide or anything. But at the time, I think he was a bit critical because it was so unusual to drive. But yeah, 79, he was very favoured, and it's not the first time. There have been a lot of drivers where they go in and they're given undisputed number one status, and that there are some titles, usually ones where they dominate it much more, where you feel like it's just a given, like it's not, such as this year with Verstappen, or 92 and 93, 2019 with Hamilton, 2013 with Vettel, where they're not really competing against anyone. With him, he still had to, because he was still racing against Villeneuve. Williams did have the better chassis, it just broke all the time. And this is the thing, is that the Ferrari chassis didn't break down much. It mostly happened to Villeneuve, and a lot of that was his extremely aggressive driving. But it was a mixture of really consistency and reliability that gave him that title at the end of the day. Okay, so we've covered 20 drivers so far, and there are 14 more to go, and there's some pretty big names left. So we're going to split this into two parts. So do make sure to join us for part 2, where we shall cover the top 14 drivers.
Yes,
Okay.
So tune in for the last 14 drivers.
You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Join us next time for part 2. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.